Well, the conventional idea is that you have plants growing in a swamp, and you know what happens in a swamp. If you go to Ireland, you see the peat bogs. Well, that's where the rotting vegetation is matted down. The standard conventional idea is that over thousands of years, the material grows and rots in forests and settles on the floor of a swamp. And then that gets, the ocean comes in perhaps, or sediments get washed in, bury that material, and then it's compressed and hardened. And so the original plant material, which has only 50% or less carbon content, is squeezed and compressed, and the water and some of the other things are boiled off or moved off, and so you get the content of the material increases, and it changes into coal. There's various grades of coal. Lower grade coals or lignites or brown coal have a higher water content, lower carbon content, but once you get up into the subbituminous, bituminous and anthracite coals, which you're familiar with in Scotland and in England, these are the ones that are sought after for operating power stations and also for steel production. Well, the interesting thing is that in a swamp, you'd expect not to have leaf material and wood because it would rot. You'd expect to find roots going all through that material. And when you look at coal, the one thing you never find are roots, which is what you'd expect if it really came from peat. What you often find is woody material and also the leaf matter, which is totally the opposite of the conventional view that over thousands of years this vegetation rotted down and formed a peat that was then buried. And we find marine fossils often associated with coal bed sequences. Sometimes we even find the marine fossils in little balls, limey balls, within the coal itself, indicating that there was an association with the oceans being on the continents, burying marine fossils, creatures that live on the ocean floor up there, and the material isn't like what you get it doesn't look like anything you get in a swamp. It's better explained by even on a small scale what we saw at Mount St Helens as a result of the 1980 eruption. The side of the mountain blew out, and as a consequence it destroyed all the forests around there, and there was a lake just to the north of Mount St Helens called Spirit Lake, and all this vegetable debris got dumped into that lake, and all the sediment material. All the logs, all the trees got stripped of their foliage and their twigs and everything, and there were these logs floating on Spirit Lake, and the bark came off. And interestingly, and some of these logs started to sink vertically. Why? Because the root end was denser and heavier, and it got waterlogged and sank first. And they found, and when they went scuba diving, they found these logs buried in the upright position as though the trees had grown in place, but there were no roots because they had been broken off. And they found the bark and the leaf and some leaf matter and it was actually forming like a peat on the bottom of Spirit Lake, and it happened within a matter of years. It was an explosive thing and rapid accumulation. And in fact, if you had burial of that material by more volcanic ash, it would have turned to coal, because we know from laboratory experiments that you can form the coal in the laboratory from vegetable material in a matter of days. It doesn't take millions of years. You just have to have the right conditions. And water, in fact, acts as a catalyst, and so does the clay minerals that are buried with the coal, in the material that becomes the coal. So the evidence indicates that coal was produced primarily as a result of forests that were either washed away by massive flooding of the continents, or even the possibility that there may have been forests that, like we see today in a quaking bog, where vegetation actually grows on top of the water surface on a mat like a floating forest. And there may have been a whole lot of floating forests surrounding the pre-flood, on the pre-flood earth, that got washed away and destroyed during the flood, because some of the trees we find buried in the coal, and interestingly, we find them also buried in upright positions. We call them polystrate fossils. Interestingly, I've got a report in the 1850s from Lancashire of a log that was found going from one coal bed for 150 feet through many geological layers almost to another coal bed. A friend of mine, a coal miner in Australia, in Newcastle, north of Sydney, he reported from the mine he was working of a log that went from one coal seam all the way through another coal seam. And, you know, that can't happen in a peat bog because the wood's going to rot. And if it takes thousands of years to bury a tree with many layers, that's going to rot before it all gets buried. So the coal indicates rapid conditions, flood conditions, exactly what we'd expect during Noah's flood. When the waters covered the earth, it's going to destroy the vegetation that's on the earth's surface. That material is going to be dumped and buried very rapidly, and therefore you've got the right conditions to see it rapidly converted to coal, because it's going to be buried very rapidly with other sediments on top. It's going to be compressed and hardened very quickly, so it will change very quickly, because we know in the laboratory it can happen very quickly. It will be converted from plant material into coal, and the carbon content will increase and therefore make it useful to us. The interesting thing I find is this, and there's a theological lesson in this. The flood was a judgment by God because of man's wickedness in the pre-flood world. But even in judgment, God was being merciful in providing us resources for us to use in the post-flood world. And I love to point that out, because of me it speaks of, yes, people often say, oh, God is horrible, you know, look what he judged those people. But he was also merciful. He preserved Noah and his family and the animals, but he also, as a result of that judgment, provided resources that we could use in that post-flood world.